I need the money tonight. The words sliced through the quiet of my home, as clean and sharp as a chisel through soft pine. My son, Ethan, stood in the center of my living room, a place he hadn't willingly entered in months. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the intricate gears of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one I'd spent the last year restoring. Its steady, rhythmic ticking was the only sound that dared to challenge his raw panic. And no delays, his wife, Chloe, added. Her voice, unlike Ethan's, had no tremor. It was hard and polished, like a river stone. She stood slightly behind him, one perfectly manicured hand on his arm, less a gesture of support and more one of a handler steadying a nervous animal. She was the one who met my gaze. In her eyes, I didn't see a daughter-in-law asking her husband's father for help. I saw a creditor assessing an asset. I remained seated in my favorite leather armchair, the scent of cedar and lemon oil from my workshop clinging to my old flannel shirt. I didn't move. I just watched them. 42 years I've known my son, and in this moment, he was a stranger. His suit, a desperate attempt at a Brooks Brothers look, was rumpled. A faint sheen of sweat graced his hairline. He was a man drowning, and he was trying to use me as a life raft. Chloe, on the other hand, was an exercise in calculated presentation. Her dress was a stark, aggressive red that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to. It was meant to project power success, but I saw the lie in it. It was the armor of the insecure, the war paint of the desperate. Ethan finally tore his gaze from the clock and took a clumsy step forward. He threw a thick manila folder onto the polished surface of my coffee table. The sound was a violation in the stillness of the room. It's all in there, he muttered, his voice hoarse. $800,000. To a man named Julian Petroselli. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. My gaze dropped from their faces to the folder. I didn't need to open it. The name was enough. Julian Petroselli. They call him a private lender, a financier for those the banks won't touch. It's a polite term. In my old world, we had a different name for men like him. Predators who build empires on the skeletons of bad decisions. He wasn't a loan shark who'd send thugs to break your knees. He was worse. He'd take your house, your career, your reputation, and your future, and do it all with a pen, a lawyer, and a bloodless smile. My son hadn't just gotten into debt. He'd stepped into a cage with a tiger. And Chloe, I suspected, was the one who had opened the door. I looked back up at them. My mind, a machine that had been dormant for 15 years, whirred to life. It bypassed the part that should have felt hurt or disappointed in my son. That could come later. Right now, it was doing what it was built to do: assess, analyze, and identify the threat. Threat assessment. Primary target, Petroselli. Nature of threat, financial and reputational annihilation. Potential physical danger as a tertiary consequence. Collateral, my son, Ethan. Catalyst, the daughter-in-law, Chloe. Immediate objective, de-escalation and information control. I saw the tremor in Ethan's hand as he gestured again at the folder. I saw the predatory stillness in Chloe as she watched my every flicker of expression. They thought they were in control. They thought they were delivering an ultimatum to a simple old man, a retired carpenter who smelled of sawdust and lived in the past. They saw the gray in my hair, the lines on my face, and the calluses on my hands, and they drew their conclusions. People always do. It's been the most effective camouflage of my entire life. You know what's funny about people who think they're smart? They mistake silence for weakness. They mistake calm for surrender. I let the silence stretch, letting the ticking of the clock measure out their rising anxiety. 1 second. 2. 3. Chloe's perfectly sculpted mask began to show the faintest of cracks. A muscle twitched in her jaw. Ethan looked like he was about to collapse. Finally, I leaned forward, my old joints protesting quietly. I didn't look at the folder. I looked at my son. Then I looked at his wife. I let a small, tired smile touch my lips. The kind of smile my old team knew meant someone was about to learn a very, very expensive lesson. Okay, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a judge's gavel. Relief washed over Ethan's face so intensely he seemed to shrink, the tension draining out of him in a rush. He had a solution. The old man would sell the house, cash out his retirement, fix the problem. Chloe's expression was different. It wasn't relief. It was triumph. A cold, satisfied certainty that her assessment had been correct. The old fool was a liquid asset, and she had just successfully initiated a withdrawal. "We'll be back in a few hours," she said, her voice smooth as silk now. She was already steering Ethan toward the door to pick up the wire transfer confirmation. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. Of course. I listened to their footsteps retreat down the gravel path, the sound of their car engine starting, a roar that faded into the suburban quiet. I sat there for another minute, alone again in my sanctuary. The room was no longer peaceful. It felt contaminated. The ticking of the clock was no longer a comfort. It was a countdown. $800,000. Tonight. To Julian Petroselli. They thought they were asking for money. They had no idea what they had really done. They hadn't just brought their problems to my door. They had unlocked it. And in doing so, they had woken up the man I had spent 15 years trying to bury. I rose from my chair, my movements deliberate. I didn't go to the phone to call my bank. I didn't go to my desk to look at my portfolio. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and descended into the cool, dark air that always smelled of earth and aged wood. I walked past my saws, my lathes, and my neatly organized tools. I walked to the far wall, to a heavy oak workbench that had been in my family for 100 years. And I began the process of reintroducing myself to my own life. The moment the sound of their car faded, the house settled back into its familiar quiet. But the silence was different now. It was heavier, tainted. Before, it was the silence of peace, of solitude. Now, it was the silence of a chessboard after the opening move. The silence of a world holding its breath. I didn't hesitate. I didn't reflect. Reflection is a luxury you can afford when time is on your side. My son and his wife had just set a bomb on my coffee table with a 2-hour timer. My job wasn't to mourn the state of my family. It was to disarm the bomb. Down in the basement, the air was cool and smelled of pine shavings and machine oil. This was my sanctuary. Every tool had its place. Every surface was clean. Order. Control. This was the world I had built for myself 15 years ago, a world where the only problems were the grain of a piece of maple or the stubborn joint of an antique chair. Tangible problems with tangible solutions. I walked past the gleaming blade of my table saw, my hand brushing against the cold, familiar steel. I stopped at the old oak workbench against the far wall. It was a monster built from a single tree by my great-grandfather. Solid, immovable, trustworthy. To any observer, it was just a workbench scarred and stained by a century of honest labor. But my grandfather was a cabinet maker, and he loved his secrets. I knelt, my knees cracking a protest. My fingers traced the intricate dovetail joints at the base. One of them, the third from the left, was a lie. I pressed a specific point on the pin board, then slid the tail sideways. There was no click, no sound at all. Just a faint vibration as an internal magnetic lock disengaged. A section of the heavy oak base swung inward, revealing a cavity lined with matte black, fireproof foam. The contents were not sentimental. There was no old photograph, no bundle of letters. There was only the cold, hard grammar of my previous life. On top lay 3 passports. One American, under a name I hadn't used in 2 decades. One Canadian. One Swiss. Beneath them sat a laptop. It wasn't a sleek, modern device. It was a dull, anonymous block of reinforced plastic, heavy and utilitarian, with no branding whatsoever. Next to it was a satellite phone and a small metallic object the size of a USB stick, a Ledger Nano, holding a portfolio of cryptocurrencies that existed for moments just like this. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single, heavy object I didn't touch. My plan was to win this with my mind, but I had always believed in being prepared for a change of plans. I took out the sat phone and the laptop. The phone whirred to life with a quiet hum, its small screen searching for a signal. It found one in seconds. There was only one number in its memory. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. A voice answered, gravelly and devoid of any warmth. "Yeah. Marcus, it's me." There was a pause. I could hear the faint sound of a city, a distant siren, the rumble of a train. I know, he said. The fact that he didn't sound surprised told me he was still the best. Figured you were dead. Or worse, happy. I said. Things change. They always do. What do you need, Arthur? I need the Philadelphia package. Full access. Another pause, this one longer. The Philadelphia package wasn't a request. It was a resurrection. It meant reactivating accounts, unlocking databases, and waking ghosts that were supposed to stay sleeping. It was the digital equivalent of unearthing an arsenal. That's a deep dig, old man, Marcus finally said. His tone wasn't questioning, just stating a fact. You sure you want to turn that key? The situation is not negotiable, I said. That was all he needed to hear. In our world, you never asked about the why. The why was a weakness. You only focused on the how. Consider the key turned, he said. The usual drop points are active. Credentials will be waiting. Don't call this number again. The line went dead. I placed the sat phone back in the compartment. I wouldn't need it again. I opened the laptop. The boot-up screen was a blank black field asking for a passphrase. I typed in a 64-character alphanumeric string that was less a phrase and more a memory of a night in Zurich under a cold rain. The desktop that appeared was Spartan, a secure browser, an encrypted terminal, nothing else. My fingers, usually stained with wood finish, moved across the keyboard with a speed and certainty that would have shocked my son. I booked a one-way ticket to Philadelphia from Boston Logan. First class. Paid in Monero. The name on the ticket was William Kane. Then I went back upstairs. I moved to my writing desk, pulled out a single sheet of my best linen paper, and uncapped my fountain pen. My handwriting, normally a fluid script, became a sharp, precise block print. The words were chosen as carefully as a surgeon chooses his scalpel. I wrote, Ethan and Chloe, you asked for money. I've gone not to give it, but to take it back. What was taken from you was not just cash. It was a piece of my peace. I intend to collect on both debts. Do not look for me. Do not call the police. And above all, do not leave my granddaughter's side. Keep Lily safe. Her safety is the only currency you have left that I value. I folded the paper, slid it into a heavy cream envelope, and wrote Finch on the front. I propped it against the folder they had left on a coffee table. It looked small and insignificant next to their mountain of a problem. A quick trip to my bedroom. I packed a small duffel bag. One change of clothes, a DOP kit, the laptop. I left my wallet, my credit cards, and my phone on the nightstand. Arthur Finch was staying home. William Kane was going to work. As I stood at the front door, keys in hand, I took one last look around. The scent of cedar, the ticking clock, the comfortable quiet. It was a good life. A life I had earned. A life I had chosen. And they had, in their greed and their foolishness, put it all at risk. They thought I was the lamb they were leading to slaughter. They had no idea I was the shepherd who had built the abattoir. 2 hours after they had delivered their ultimatum, I was in a taxi, watching the familiar suburban streets of my neighborhood blur into the sodium glare of the highway. Logan Airport was ahead, and beyond that, Philadelphia, and a man named Julian Petroselli, who was about to learn a very old, very simple lesson. The most dangerous predators are the ones you never see coming. Chloe checked her Cartier watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. The diamonds on the bezel glittered under the sterile fluorescent lights of the Starbucks where they'd been waiting. It was 9:47 p.m. He's had enough time, she said, her voice tight with a nervous energy she was failing to conceal. Let's go. I want to see that wire confirmation before I can breathe again. Ethan nodded mutely, swirling the dregs of a cold latte in his paper cup. He hadn't said more than 5 words since they left his father's house. The initial surge of adrenaline had been replaced by a gnawing unease. He just strong-armed his own father. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. But then he'd glance at Chloe, at her fierce, unwavering certainty, and the guilt would recede, replaced by the familiar, intoxicating promise of salvation. She was his rock, his compass. He just wished she didn't always point him toward a cliff's edge. He'll do it, Chloe insisted, as if sensing his doubt. He has to. What else is he going to do? He's old, he's alone. You're all he has. He won't let us go under. Her logic was a fortress, and Ethan took shelter in it. Of course she was right. His father was a simple man. A predictable man. Family was everything to him, especially Lily. He'd do anything for his granddaughter. The drive back to the quiet, tree-lined street was quick. They pulled into the driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires of their leased BMW sounding unnaturally loud in the suburban stillness. All the lights in the house were off. "He's probably gone to bed," Ethan said, a fresh pang of guilt hitting him. "We shouldn't have." "Don't be ridiculous," Chloe snapped, already out of the car. "He knows we're coming. He's just being dramatic." She strode to the front door and knocked, a sharp, impatient rap of her knuckles against the solid oak. They waited. The only answer was the chirping of crickets. She knocked again, harder this time. "Dad," Ethan called out, his voice weak. "We're here." Nothing. A cold dread began to seep into Ethan's bones. This wasn't right. His father was a man of routine. At 10 p.m., he would be in his armchair, reading, a single lamp casting a warm glow on the page. The house would never be this dark, this silent. Chloe, ever the pragmatist, tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, Ethan close behind her. "Arthur," she called into the darkness, her voice echoing slightly in the hall. She found the light switch. The living room flickered to life, revealing a scene of perfect, undisturbed order. The leather armchair was empty. The book on the side table was closed. The only thing out of place was the manila folder they had left on the coffee table, and a single cream-colored envelope propped against it. Chloe saw it first. She moved toward it with the predatory grace of a cat approaching a mouse. She snatched it up, her red nails a slash of color against the pale paper. "Here it is," she said, a triumphant smirk returning to her lips. The confirmation, probably a cashier's check. Old school. She tore it open with a careless flick of her wrist. Ethan watched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it, the moment of deliverance. $800,000 of absolution. Chloe pulled out the single sheet of folded linen paper. She unfolded it. Her smirk faltered. Her eyes scanned the page, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in a frown of confusion. "What is this?" she whispered. She thrust the paper at Ethan. He took it with a trembling hand. The text was in stark, block letters. Clinical. Cold. "Ethan and Chloe, you asked for money. I've gone not to give it, but to take it back. What was taken from you is not just cash. It was a piece of my peace. I intend to collect on both debts. Do not look for me. Do not call the police. And above all, do not leave my granddaughter's side. Keep Lily safe. Her safety is the only currency you have left that I value." Ethan read it once, then twice. The words swam before his eyes, refusing to make sense. It felt like a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank. He looked around the empty room, half expecting his father to step out from the shadows, a disappointed look on his face. But there was only silence. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its relentless ticking, each second a hammer blow against his crumbling reality. "What does he mean? Take it back." Ethan stammered, looking at Chloe. Chloe's face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. The triumphant predator was gone. In her place was a cornered animal. Her mind, quick and sharp, was racing, trying to process the impossible. An old carpenter doesn't just disappear. He doesn't write cryptic notes. He doesn't talk about collecting debts. Her eyes fell on the folder again. Her hands, suddenly clumsy, fumbled to open it. She pulled out the sheaf of papers detailing her catastrophic debt to Petrocelli. But tucked inside, something new had been added. A single, freshly printed sheet of paper. It was a transaction history. Not from a bank, but from a blockchain explorer. A detailed, minute-by-minute breakdown of a series of disastrously leveraged trades on a highly volatile altcoin. Her trades, the ones she'd made in secret, convinced she was a genius, certain she could turn a small loan from a friend into a fortune. The ones that had gone so spectacularly wrong. But this printout contained details she had told no one. The specific offshore exchange she used. The wallet addresses. The exact timestamps. Information that no one, not even Petrocelli's accountants, should have had access to. It was as if someone had been standing over her shoulder, watching her every click. Ethan looked at the paper over her shoulder. He didn't understand the technical jargon. but he understood the look on his wife's face. It was a look of pure, undiluted terror. "Ow!" Chloe breathed, the single word a wisp of sound. How could he know this? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. They looked at each other, the same shocking realization dawning in their eyes. The man they thought they knew, the quiet, simple, unassuming father and father-in-law, did not exist. He was a fiction, a carefully constructed facade, and they had just, with their own greed and arrogance, smashed it to pieces. The ticking of the clock suddenly sounded like a timer on a different kind of bomb. They hadn't brought their problem to a kindly old man for a bailout. They had delivered it to a complete stranger. A stranger with resources they couldn't comprehend and a past they couldn't imagine. And he wasn't running away from their problem. He was running towards it. "Oh my God," Ethan whispered, the papers slipping from his fingers and fluttering to the floor. "What have we done?" Philadelphia, in the dead of night, is a different city. The historic charm recedes, and the industrial bones show through. My taxi cut through streets slick with a fine mist, past darkened storefronts and the skeletal silhouettes of cranes on the waterfront. I wasn't heading for the Ritz-Carlton or the Four Seasons. Men on my kind of business don't stay in places with attentive bellhops and security cameras in every hallway. The driver, a heavy-set man with a weary face, glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Here we are, pal. Fishtown. You sure this is the right address?" The building was an old brick warehouse, its windows dark and vacant, a ghost of the city's manufacturing past. A faded sign above the loading bay read Keystone Textiles. It had been out of business for 30 years. "This is it," I said, my voice neutral. I paid him in cash, adding a generous tip. The kind of tip that encourages a man to forget a face. He grunted his thanks and sped off, his red taillights disappearing into the gloom. I walked not to the front entrance, but around the side, into a narrow, refuse-strewn alley. A single steel door was set into the brickwork, featureless except for a small, dark keypad. I didn't touch it. I stood before it and waited. 30 seconds later, a faint click echoed in the alley. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The man standing there was an illusion. He looked like a tired academic, with a tweed jacket frayed at the elbows, silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, and a halo of thinning white hair. But his eyes were not the eyes of a professor. They were the eyes of a watchmaker, missing nothing, constantly calculating, seeing the world as a series of interlocking mechanisms. "Arthur," Marcus said, his voice a dry rasp, "I see you haven't improved your choice of travel destinations." "The views are invigorating," I replied, stepping past him into a cavernous, dimly lit space. The ground floor was a graveyard of old machinery, shrouded in tarps and dust. But the air wasn't stale. It was cool and filtered, humming with the low thrum of powerful servers. Marcus led me to a freight elevator in the back, its steel gate rattling shut like a jail cell door. We ascended in silence. The fourth floor was a different world, a sprawling, minimalist loft bathed in the cold blue light of a dozen monitors. Cables snaked across the polished concrete floor like organized ivy. This was Marcus's web. From this anonymous room, he could touch any corner of the digital world. He was a ghost in the machine, a virtuoso of data. He didn't hack systems. He persuaded them to open. "Thought you were happy making birdhouses for the granddaughter," he said, gesturing to a sleek, modern workstation that stood in stark contrast to his own cluttered desk. "What happened?" "HOA dispute get out of hand." I set my bag down and took the offered seat. It was a high-end ergonomic chair that probably cost more than my first car. "Something like that," I said. I looked at the main screen. It was already filled with data streams, encrypted communications intercepts, and financial trackers. "My Philadelphia package." "Julian Petroselli," Marcus said, following my gaze. He tapped a few keys, and a photograph filled the screen. A man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the predatory smile of a shark that knows it's at the top of the food chain. Ambitious bastard. Started as a legit high-risk lender. Found out there was more money in owning people than in owning their debt. He's a specialist in what he calls reputational leverage. Blackmail, I translated. A blunter term, but accurate. Marcus nodded. He doesn't break legs. He breaks lives. Finds a weakness, gambling, affairs, business fraud, and sinks his teeth in. Once he owns you, you're an annuity. He's got a state senator, a tech CEO, and half a dozen prominent doctors in his pocket, just to name a few. He's careful, insulates himself with layers of shell corporations and trusts. The money flows through a labyrinth, untouchable by conventional means. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the network diagrams, the flowcharts of capital moving through Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, Singapore. It was a masterpiece of obfuscation, beautiful in its own way. But every masterpiece has a flaw. Every artist signs their work. Conventional means are for people with time, I said. I have until he decides my son's family is more valuable as a warning than as a source of income. I don't need to dismantle his empire, Marcus. I just need to find the load-bearing wall and crack it. Marcus fell silent, his fingers flying across his keyboard, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of information. Windows opened and closed. Encrypted files were decrypted and discarded. He was peeling back the layers of Petruccelli's digital life. His personal security is tight, Marcus murmured, more to himself than to me. Exmosath. His digital footprint is scrubbed daily. He communicates through proprietary encrypted channels. Doesn't trust anything commercial. Everyone trusts someone, I said. No man is an island, not even one who owns a few. I spent the next several hours in a state of pure, undiluted focus. The smell of sawdust and cedar was replaced by the smell of ozone and stale coffee. The rhythmic ticking of my grandfather clock was replaced by the click-clack of keys and the hum of cooling fans. This was a different kind of craftsmanship, not shaping wood, but shaping reality. Sifting through mountains of raw data, financial records, travel manifests, phone logs, social media whispers from third and fourth tier associates, looking for a pattern, a tell, a mistake. Petruccelli was a ghost. He left no tracks. His business was conducted through cutouts. His personal life was a fortress. But the money had to move. And money, no matter how well you wash it, always carries a scent. It was almost dawn when I found it. It wasn't in a billion-dollar transaction or a secret ledger. It was in a series of small, seemingly insignificant payments. A monthly transfer, always the same amount. Euro 75,000, originating from a trust in Liechtenstein and terminating at a very exclusive, very private pediatric oncology clinic in Zurich. The payments were authorized by a single signature, not Petruccelli's. The signature belonged to a man named Leo Grossman. Marcus brought up Grossman's file. A picture appeared on the screen, a man in his late 60s, with worried eyes and the perpetually stooped shoulders of someone carrying a great weight. He was Petruccelli's personal attorney, his fixer, the architect of the entire corporate labyrinth. He was the brain behind the throne, the man who made the bodies disappear, legally speaking. Leo Grossman, Marcus read aloud. Top of his class at Harvard Law. Made a name for himself in hostile takeovers in the 90s. Vanished from the public about 15 years ago. Been Petruccelli's sole counsel ever since. Clean record. No vices. No weaknesses. He paused, looking at the clinic's name on the other screen. Almost no weaknesses. He pulled up the clinic's records. It took him less than a minute. Leo Grossman's granddaughter, Sarah, age 12, diagnosed 2 years ago with a rare and aggressive form of neuroblastoma. The clinic in Zurich was her only hope, a place offering an experimental treatment with a staggering price tag. A price tag Leo Grossman, for all his brilliance, could never have afforded on his own. That was it, the signature, the flaw in the masterpiece. Petruccelli's empire wasn't built on his own genius. It was built on the genius of a desperate old man. A man who would do anything, sign anything, and bury anything to save his grandchild. Julian Petruccelli hadn't bought a lawyer. He had bought a man's soul. And anything that can be bought, I thought, can be broken. I have my lever, I said, the first words I'd spoken in hours. Marcus looked from the screen to me, a flicker of something, respect, maybe, or just professional appreciation, in his watchmaker's eyes. "What's the plan, Arthur?" "You don't attack a king by storming the castle," I said, my gaze fixed on the tired, worried face of Leo Grossman. "You find a man who built the walls, and you offer him a better deal." Dawn was breaking over the Delaware River, painting the grimy industrial sky in shades of bruised purple and dirty orange. I hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury for a future I was still trying to secure. My world had shrunk to the glowing rectangle of the monitor and the quiet hum of Marcus's servers. My mind was a schematic, laying out the intricate wiring of Julian Petrocelli's life, searching for the circuit breaker. Leo Grossman was more than a load-bearing wall. He was the foundation. Petrocelli was the public face, the predator who smiled for the cameras at charity galas. Grossman was the architect in the shadows, the man who designed the cage, sharpened the teeth, and cleaned up the blood. He was the system. "Marcus," I said, my voice rough from hours of disuse. "I need to know everything about Grossman, not his professional life, his personal life, what he eats for breakfast, the brand of coffee he drinks, the route he takes to work. I need the texture of his day." "You want to get inside his head," Marcus stated, not a question, but an observation. He was already typing, his fingers a blur. "That's your real workshop, isn't it, Arthur? Not the one with the saws and chisels." He wasn't wrong. For 30 years, my job had been to understand the architecture of human motivation. Greed, fear, pride, love, they were all just different kinds of wood. Some were hard and dense, others were soft and pliable. The trick was to know which tool to use and where to apply the pressure. The data began to flow. Grossman's life was a testament to disciplined misery. He lived in a modest home in a quiet Philadelphia suburb, a house he could have afforded 20 years ago before Petrocelli. He drove a 5-year-old Volvo. He was a widower. His only social interactions were with the nurses at a long-term care facility where his wife had spent her final years, and now, with the doctors in Zurich. He had no friends, only associates. His entire existence had been hollowed out and refilled with two things: his work for Petrocelli and his terror for his granddaughter. "He's a ghost," Marcus commented, scrolling through surveillance logs. "Home to the office. Office to home. Once a week, he visits a specific park bench overlooking the Schuylkill River. Sits there for exactly 1 hour, then leaves. Rain or shine. That's his church," I said. "The place he goes to talk to his ghosts." I made a note of the time and day. The most critical piece of information, however, was the payment schedule for the Zurich clinic. Marcus sliced through the Swiss banking system's legendary privacy with the contemptuous ease of a master locksmith picking a simple tumbler lock. The payments were made on the 5th of every month. The next one was due in 3 days. The funds were transferred from the Liechtenstein Trust, but the final authorization command had to be initiated by Grossman himself from his secure terminal at his office. A two-key system. Petrocelli provided the funds. Grossman turned the key. It was a leash designed to look like a partnership. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a single idea, but as a series of precise, interlocking steps. A piece of fine joinery. Each cut had to be perfect. Each joint had to be seamless. "Marcus," I said, "I need 2 things. First, I need a 48-hour administrative delay on that payment to Zurich. Not a cancellation, not a block, just a bureaucratic snag. A misplaced form, a system update, a holiday nobody in Liechtenstein heard of. Something plausible that will show up on Grossman's end as pending instead of failed." Marcus smiled, a rare, thin-lipped expression. "My cousin's wife's nephew owes me a favor. He's a mid-level compliance officer at a very discreet bank in Vaduz. Consider your paperwork misplaced. Second," I continued, "I need a package delivered to Grossman. Anonymously, but it has to look like it came from an internal source. A leak from within Petrocelli's own organization." I began to dictate. What I was creating was a work of fiction, but like all good fiction, it was woven from threads of truth. Marcus had unearthed chatter about a nascent SEC inquiry into some of Petrocelli's more aggressive real estate acquisitions. It was minor, a fishing expedition, but it was real. I used that as the foundation. I fabricated an internal memo, written in Petroselli's typically arrogant and dismissive style. The memo outlined a contingency plan, a firewall strategy. It detailed a plan to sacrifice a senior executive to appease the regulators, should the inquiry gain traction. The name of the executive, mentioned with cold, clinical detachment, was Leo Grossman. I layered it with details only an insider would know. References to specific deals, private codes, even a casual, cruel joke about Grossman's devotion to his granddaughter. Marcus worked his magic, formatting it on what looked like Petroselli's personal letterhead, complete with a watermark and a faint coffee ring stain he digitally lifted from another document. It was a perfect forgery, a phantom document designed to prey on a man's deepest fears. We're not just showing him he's disposable. I explained as Marcus uploaded the file to a secure server, preparing it for a ghost delivery via a compromised courier service. We're showing him that the one thing he sacrificed his soul for, his granddaughter's care, is tied to the very man who is planning to discard him. We're creating a crisis of faith. The trap was set. The beauty of it was its subtlety. I wasn't attacking Grossman. I wasn't threatening him. I was simply creating a set of circumstances, a perfect storm of fear and doubt that would force him to reevaluate his loyalties. I was making his cage, the one he had lived in for 15 years, suddenly feel very small and very cold. The first move wouldn't be a threat or a demand. It would be an act of calculated chaos delivered on a piece of paper, a stone tossed into the placid, miserable pond of Leo Grossman's life. And I would be there, waiting to see which way the ripples went. Package will be on his desk tomorrow morning, Marcus confirmed, leaning back in his chair. He looked at me, his analytical gaze softening for a fraction of a second. You know, Arthur, for a man who builds beautiful things with his hands, you have a remarkable talent for taking things apart. I looked at the image of Leo Grossman on the screen, at the profound sadness etched into his face. Sometimes, I said quietly, the only way to build something new is to tear the old structure down to the studs. The next 48 hours were an exercise in disciplined patience. For me, it was a familiar state. It was the same patience required to wait for glue to set on a complex joint or for layers of varnish to cure. You can't rush it. You apply the pressure, you set the conditions, and then you step back and let physics or human nature do the work. Marcus was my eyes and ears. His loft became my command center. We watched the digital life of Leo Grossman unfold in real time. We saw the courier's dispatch log mark the package as delivered and signed for at 8:15 a.m. We saw Grossman's office lights turn on at 8:30 a.m. sharp, as they did every day. He's opened it, Marcus murmured at 8:37 a.m. He was monitoring network traffic from Grossman's firm. His keystroke pattern has changed. It's more erratic. He's running searches, cross-referencing names from the memo. He's looking for corroboration. He wouldn't find any. The memo was a ghost. But the seeds of doubt had been planted in fertile ground. For the rest of the day, Grossman was a model of professionalism. His calendar showed him in meetings, drafting contracts, making calls. But his digital trail told a different story. In the quiet moments between tasks, he was digging, searching for whispers of the SEC inquiry, trying to access personnel files he wasn't authorized to see. He was a man checking the foundations of a house he'd lived in for years, suddenly terrified it was about to collapse. The next day was the 5th of the month, payment day. At precisely 9 a.m., we saw the login sequence initiate on the Liechtenstein Bank's secure portal from Grossman's terminal. He's turning the key, I said, leaning closer to the monitor. The process took less than a minute. Then, a new status appeared on the transaction log Marcus was mirroring. A single, damning word in German. Ostend. Pending. The paperwork has been misplaced, Marcus said with a thin smile. We watched the digital fallout. For the next hour, there was a flurry of activity. Secure emails from Grossman to the bank. Formal, then urgent, then demanding. The replies from Marcus's cousin's wife's nephew were a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. Apologies for the inconvenience. Unforeseen system maintenance. Assurances that the matter was being given the highest priority. Grossman tried to call his personal contact at the bank. The contact was, conveniently, out of the office with a sudden stomach ailment. Panic is a rising tide. For a man like Grossman, a man whose entire life was built on control and precision, this was torture. The two pillars of his existence, Petrocelli's power and the flow of money that kept his granddaughter alive, were simultaneously cracking. At 3 p.m., he did something he hadn't done in the 6 years of data Marcus had on him. He left the office in the middle of the day. "He's on the move," Marcus announced, tracking his car's GPS. "He's not going home." "I know where he's going," I said. I was already on my feet, shrugging on a simple, dark jacket. I was no longer William Kane, the anonymous business traveler. I was just an old man, out for a walk. "He's heading for the Schuylkill River Park," Marcus confirmed. "Your church. Keep a line open," I said, clipping a tiny, almost invisible earpiece into my ear. "No talking unless I'm compromised. Just listen." I took a taxi to a point 5 blocks from the park. The rest of the way, I walked. The air was crisp, the autumn sun low in the sky. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that feels like a mockery when your world is falling apart. I saw him from a distance. He was sitting on his usual bench, a solitary figure staring out at the rowers gliding across the water. He wasn't seeing them. His shoulders were slumped, his hands clenched in his lap. He was a man drowning in broad daylight. This was the moment, the most delicate part of the operation. I couldn't approach him like an operative or a threat. I had to approach him like a memory, a ghost of a conscience he thought he'd long since buried. I bought 2 coffees from a nearby vendor. Black, no sugar. I walked slowly, my footsteps measured, calm. I didn't approach his bench head-on. I came at it from an angle, as if I were just another lonely old man looking for a place to sit. I stopped in front of his bench. He didn't look up. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice quiet, conversational. All the other ones seemed to be taken. He grunted, a sound that was neither a yes nor a no. I took it as an invitation. I sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between us. I placed one of the coffee cups on the bench, midway between us. "Figured you could use one," I said. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world today." He finally turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a weary red. They were the eyes of a man who hadn't slept. He saw what everyone saw, a gray-haired man in a simple jacket, unremarkable, harmless. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "No," I said, taking a sip of my own coffee. "But I know you, Leo." His entire body went rigid. Every ounce of feigned indifference vanished, replaced by pure, cold alarm. His lawyer's mind was instantly sorting through possibilities. Who was I? Sick? FBI? A messenger from a rival? I didn't give him time to ask. I kept my gaze on the river, my tone gentle, almost melancholic. "It's a terrible thing, isn't it?" I said. "When you realize the monster you've been feeding all these years is starting to look at you like its next meal." He said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle throbbing. And the timing, I continued, shaking my head with feigned sympathy. Always the worst possible time, just when you need everything to be stable. When there are family matters to consider, delicate health situations. Situations in, say, Switzerland that depend on things running smoothly. That was the kill shot. I had just connected the 2 nightmares that were consuming him, the forged memo and the delayed payment. I had shown him they weren't a coincidence. They were a design. He finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Who are you?" I turned to look him in the eye for the first time. I didn't smile. I didn't threaten. I just let him see the absolute certainty in my gaze. "I'm the man offering you a better deal," I said. "I'm the man who can make the payment go through in the next 5 minutes. I'm the man who can give you and your granddaughter a new life, under a new name, with the best security the private sector can buy. A life where you don't have to wake up every morning wondering if the devil you work for has decided to cash in your soul." He stared at me, his brilliant mind working furiously, trying to understand the impossible situation he was in. "What do you want?" he breathed. "I don't want your money, Leo," I said. "I want something you have that is far more valuable." I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping. "I want the keys to Julian Petrocelli's kingdom. Every account number, every password, every dirty little secret he uses to keep his world turning. You give me that, and I give you back your life. The one you thought you lost a long time ago. I stood up, leaving the untouched coffee cup on the bench. You have my number, I said, though I had given him none. He would understand. When you decide you'd rather be a grandfather than a scapegoat, you'll know how to reach me. You have until midnight. After that, the offer and the payment in Zurich expire permanently. I turned and walked away without looking back, leaving him alone on the bench with the cooling coffee and the ruins of his life. The first move was complete. Now it was his turn to play. The journey back to the warehouse was a slow crawl through rush hour traffic. The city was a frantic mess of noise and light, but inside my head, there was only a profound and focused silence. I had laid the fuse. Now I had to wait for the spark. Back in the loft, the air was thick with the aroma of strong coffee. Marcus hadn't moved from his chair. He glanced up as I entered, his eyes asking the question his voice didn't. "The hook is set," I said, shrugging off my jacket. "Now we see if the fish will bite." I made myself a cup of tea. The simple ritual of boiling water and steeping leaves was a necessary anchor. It was a piece of my quiet life, a small act of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. The clock on Marcus's main monitor was a stark digital red. 7:13 p.m. Midnight was the deadline. We waited. The hours crawled by. The city outside muted its roar, the lights of the skyscrapers forming a silent, glittering web against the dark sky. To me, it looked like a diagram of a nervous system, raw and exposed. At 9 p.m., Marcus spoke, his voice low. He's not going to call Arthur. Men like him, they're creatures of habit. They're loyal to the cage they know, even when the door is open. He's not loyal to the cage, I said, my gaze fixed on the screen, watching a meaningless data stream flicker. He's loyal to what's in the cage with him. His granddaughter. Right now, he's doing the math. 15 years of servitude versus a lifetime of freedom for her. It's the only calculus that matters to a man like that. I knew that calculation. I had built my life on it. I had seen good men do terrible things for the people they loved. And I had seen broken men find the strength for one last act of courage for the exact same reason. 10:30 p.m. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the servers. Even Marcus was still, watching me, trying to read the unreadable. 11:15 p.m. My own resolve began to fray at the edges. Had I misread him? Had Petroselli's hold on him been so complete, so absolute, that even the promise of his granddaughter's future wasn't enough to break it? Then, at 11:28 p.m., a small, encrypted communication window popped up on one of Marcus's secondary monitors. It wasn't a call. It wasn't an email. It was a single, untraceable text packet sent from a burner phone to a dead-drop server Marcus had set up. The message contained one word. Where? I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I took the keyboard from Marcus. My reply was just as brief. I sent the address of a 24-hour diner in South Philly. A greasy spoon called the Penrose. Bushu. Public. Loud. The perfect place for a quiet conversation. I added a time. 12:30 a.m. Marcus looked at the address. You're meeting him? Alone. This isn't about force, Marcus, I said, standing up. This is a confession. You need a priest for that, not a platoon. The Penrose diner smelled of old coffee, sizzling bacon, and despair. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, the tabletops were sticky, and a lone, tired-looking waitress was refilling sugar dispensers behind the counter. I chose a booth in the back corner, one that gave me a clear view of the entrance, but kept me away from the main windows. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Leo Grossman arrived at 12:29 a.m. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in the last 2 days. His suit was rumpled, his face was the color of ash, and his eyes were pits of exhaustion. He saw me, and for a moment, he hesitated at the door, a flicker of pure animal fear on his face. Then he seemed to gather the last of his resolve and walk toward my booth. He slid into the seat opposite me. He didn't order anything. He didn't say hello. He just sat there, a man hollowed out. He was going to let her die, he whispered, his voice cracking. It wasn't a question. It was the conclusion he had reached in the dark hours of his soul searching. The SEC thing, it was a pretense. He was looking for a way to cut me loose. And her with me. I know, I said quietly. My confirmation seemed to settle him, the last piece of his rationalization clicking into place. This was no longer a betrayal. It was an act of survival. Without another word, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single, unremarkable object, a small, black USB flash drive. He placed it on the sticky tabletop and slid it across to me. It made a faint scratching sound. The keys to the kingdom. My hand closed around it. It felt cool and inert, belying the destructive power it contained. The core ledgers are on there, Grossman said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Client lists, offshore accounts, with access protocols, voice recordings from his leveraged negotiations. Everything. It's all protected by a single passphrase. He slid a folded napkin across the table. On it was a string of letters and numbers. That's the name of his first boat. The one he bought with the money from his first hostile takeover. He's a sentimental man, in his own sociopathic way. I nodded. I pulled my own laptop from my bag, the unassuming block of black plastic. I inserted the drive. I connected to Marcus's secure network through a series of ghost relays. I typed in the passphrase. Folders bloomed across my screen. A digital labyrinth of greed, fear, and human misery, all neatly organized. It was Petrocelli's entire life's work. His soul, digitized and delivered on a $5 piece of hardware. I didn't waste time exploring. I had a promise to keep. I navigated to the financial controls, located the Liechtenstein Trust, and found the pending transaction to the Zurich clinic. With a few keystrokes, I rerouted the authorization through a different, clean channel and executed the transfer myself. I turned the laptop so Grossman could see the screen. Transaction complete. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost violent. The tension in his shoulders disappeared. The lines of terror around his eyes softened. For the first time, he looked like a man who could breathe. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you disappear," I said. "There's a car waiting for you 2 blocks from here. It will take you to a private airfield. A jet will fly you to Zurich. A new life is waiting for you and your granddaughter. My associate has arranged everything." He simply nodded, too exhausted to speak. He stood up on shaky legs, a ghost leaving his own haunting. He walked out of the diner and into the night without looking back. I closed the laptop. The flash drive was still in the port. Petrocelli believed his power came from his money, his threats, his reputation. He was wrong. His power came from the loyalty of one desperate man. A loyalty he hadn't earned, but merely purchased. He hadn't bought a man's soul. He had simply rented it from a higher bidder, a grandfather's love. I paid for my coffee and left the diner. The first part of my plan was complete. The foundation of Petrocelli's empire was gone. Now, it was time to talk to the king. Summoning Julian Petrocelli wasn't difficult. Men like him are insulated by layers of security and lawyers, but they are also slaves to their own curiosity and arrogance. The idea that someone would dare to challenge them directly is an irresistible mystery. Through a secure, anonymous channel, Marcus sent a single message to Petrocelli's personal encrypted device. It read, "The Penrose Diner. Leo Grossman sends his regards. We need to discuss the Finch family debt and the architecture of your future. The old textile warehouse in Fishtown. 10 p.m. Come alone, and you might still have a business tomorrow. Don't, and you'll be reading about yourself in the Wall Street Journal." It was a hook baited with the 3 things Petrocelli couldn't ignore: a betrayal by his most trusted man, a threat to his assets, and a challenge to his power. He would come, and he would not come alone. I was at the warehouse an hour early. Marcus had already wiped our digital presence from the building's network, leaving it a ghost once more. The vast, open space of the 4th-floor loft was empty, save for a single heavy oak table and 2 chairs placed in the center, directly under a stark industrial light fixture. My laptop sat on the table, closed. The place felt like a stage, waiting for the final act. I sat in one of the chairs, facing the freight elevator, and I waited. My breathing was slow and even. My heart rate was steady. This wasn't a battle. This was a closing. The final, quiet signature on a deal that had already been struck. At 10:02 p.m., the freight elevator rumbled to life. The heavy gate groaned open, and 3 men stepped out. 2 were large, broad-shouldered men in expensive but functional suits. Their eyes were cold and professional, constantly scanning the empty room, their hands never far from the bulges under their jackets. Between them stood Julian Petrocelli. He was exactly as he looked in the photographs. Perfectly tailored suit, silver hair swept back from his forehead, a confident, predatory smile playing on his lips. He looked around the empty loft with an air of amused contempt. Then his eyes settled on me. Alone, old man sitting at a table. His smile widened. He had clearly expected a rival, an armed crew, a show of force. He saw a tired carpenter. He strode forward, his bodyguards fanning out behind him. He stopped at the other side of the table, looking down at me as if I were a piece of furniture. "So," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone, "you're the ghostwriter for old Leo. I have to admit, I'm underwhelmed. I was expecting something more substantial." I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply met his gaze. "Substance is often deceptive, Julian. You, of all people, should know that." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My use of his first name, the complete lack of fear in my voice, had thrown him off balance. "Let's dispense with the theatrics, shall we?" he said, regaining his composure. "You have my attention. You have my lawyer, apparently. What is it you want? A payoff? A piece of the action? Name your price. Let's not waste each other's time." "I'm not here to negotiate," I said calmly. "I'm here to present the terms of your surrender." He actually laughed. A short, sharp, incredulous bark. "My surrender? To you? Old man, you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood the situation you are in." He gestured to his bodyguards. "I own this room. I own your son. And right now, I own you." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. "Let me tell you what I own, Julian." I opened the laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a simple text file. On a passphrase. "It's the Siren's Call. The name of the first boat you bought after the Sterling Pharmaceuticals takeover in '98. The one you paid for by bankrupting 2,000 pensioners." The color drained from Petrocelli's face. The amused arrogance vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark watchfulness. That name was a secret buried deeper than any body. With that passphrase, I continued, my voice remaining level, "I own the master ledger to your entire financial empire." I clicked a key. The screen changed to a live feed of his primary holding account in the Cayman Islands. A balance of over 9 figures glowed on the screen. "I also own this." I clicked again. A window opened, showing a waveform of an audio file. I tapped the spacebar. Petrocelli's own voice filled the silent room, cold and clear. "The senator understands. His daughter's problem stays a private matter as long as the zoning variance is approved. If not, the photos go to the press. It's that simple." I stopped the recording. "I have 3,000 hours of recordings just like that one, Julian. Enough to keep the Department of Justice busy for a decade. Enough to send every one of your clients to prison or divorce court." Petrocelli was no longer looking at me. He was staring at the laptop as if it were a cobra poised to strike. His face was a mask of disbelief and rising fury. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "I own this." I brought up a pre-drafted email. The recipient list was a roll call of every major financial news outlet, the SEC, the IRS, and the personal email addresses of his most powerful and most compromised associates. The subject line was simple: the Petrocelli files. Attached was the flash drive's entire contents. "Right now, my finger is on the send button," I said. "You came in here thinking you were a king in your castle. The truth is, you're in a glass house, in the middle of an earthquake, and I'm the man with the hammer." He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the light fixture above us. He looked at his bodyguards, a flicker of violent intent in his eyes. "They can break my bones," I said, anticipating his thought. "But my associate, Marcus, is monitoring this meeting. If I don't send him an all-clear signal in the next 5 minutes, He has instructions to send that email. It's a dead man's switch, Julian. Your empire will be ashes before my body is cold. Checkmate. He knew it. I could see the moment the fight went out of him. The predator in his eyes was replaced by the cold, hard calculation of a survivor. He had lost. Now it was about cutting his losses. What are your terms? He asked, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. They are simple, and they are not negotiable, I said. I switched the screen back to his bank account. Term 1. The $800,000 debt owed by Chloe Finch is hereby null and void. Erased from every record. You will provide a signed, notarized letter of debt forgiveness, effective immediately. Term 2. The names Arthur, Ethan, Chloe, and Lily Finch will be permanently erased from your memory and your files. You will never contact them, approach them, or interfere in their lives in any way, ever again. If I so much as hear a whisper of your name near theirs, the email gets sent. Term 3, I said, looking him directly in the eye, is a fine for the disruption to my peace. You're going to transfer $100 million from this account to an account I specify. Consider it a charitable donation. For your soul. He stared at the number, his face twisting in a mask of rage. 100 million? That's extortion. No, Julian, I said softly. It's justice. The account belongs to a foundation that funds experimental pediatric cancer treatments. It's the same one that takes care of Leo Grossman's granddaughter. You're going to do one decent thing with your filthy money. This was the final twist of the knife. Not just taking his money, but forcing him to use it for good. For his victim, it was an indignity he would never forget. He stood there, trapped and defeated. The king had been cornered by a pawn. He looked at the screen, at the numbers that represented his life's work. Then he gave a short, sharp nod to his man on the right. The bodyguard produced a small, secure tablet. Petrocelli took it, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed rage. He typed in his credentials and, with a final, hateful glance at me, he authorized the transfer. I watched on my own screen as a 9-figure sum vanished from his account. The letter of forgiveness, I said. His other man produced a briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a pre-prepared folder. He slid across the table. I opened it and reviewed the document. It was exactly what I'd asked for. I closed my laptop. The meeting was over. It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Julian, I said, standing up for the first time. I turned and walked toward the freight elevator, leaving him standing there in the vast, empty room, $100 million poorer and infinitely smaller. I didn't look back. Winners never do. The flight back to Boston was quiet. I didn't look out the window at the patchwork of city lights giving way to darkness. My gaze was turned inward. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the cold, hard clarity of what came next. The war with Petrocelli was over. The war for my family was about to begin. Winning the first had been a matter of strategy and leverage. Winning the second would require something far more difficult, facing the wreckage my own blood had created. I arrived home just before dawn. The house was exactly as I had left it, silent and still. The only difference was the single sheet of paper, the cryptocurrency transaction history I had printed for Chloe, lying on the floor where Ethan had dropped it. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my pocket. I made a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me. Then I sent a single text to Ethan's phone. My house. 8 Uhr morgens. Both of you. Bring Lily. They arrived at 7:59. They looked even worse than they had 3 days ago. Ethan was pale and unshaven, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. Chloe's armor was gone. Her expensive dress had been replaced with simple jeans and a sweater. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the terrified uncertainty that had taken up residence there. And between them, holding each of their hands, was Lily, my granddaughter, 8 years old, with my late wife's bright, curious eyes and a smile that had been the sole focus of my world for years. Seeing her, so small and innocent between her 2 fractured parents, solidified my resolve. Everything I had done, and everything I was about to do, was for her. "Grandpa," she cried, letting go of their hands and running to me. I knelt down and wrapped her in a hug, burying my face in her hair. It smelled of kids' shampoo and sunshine. For a moment, I just held her, drawing strength from her. This was the only thing in the world that was real. The only thing that mattered. "Hey, sweet pea," I said, my voice thick. "Why don't you go down to the workshop? I left that little wooden bird we were carving on the bench. You can start sanding it. I'll be down in a little bit." She beamed and ran off toward the basement, her footsteps thudding down the stairs. When I stood up and faced Ethan and Chloe, my expression was granite. The warmth was gone. The grandfather was gone. They were facing the man from the Philadelphia warehouse. I gestured to the sofa. "Seat." It was a command, not an invitation. They sat, perched on the edge of the cushions like defendants awaiting a verdict. I didn't sit. I stood before them, creating a space of authority. I pulled 2 documents from my jacket pocket. I tossed the first one onto the coffee table in front of them. It was the notarized letter from Petrocelli forgiving the debt. Chloe snatched it up, her eyes scanning it frantically. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over her. So powerful, she seemed to sag. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You did it. You actually did it." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with a bewildered awe. "Dad, how? Who are you?" I ignored his question. I tossed the second document on top of the first. It was the printout of Chloe's crypto trades. "That," I said, my voice low and cold, "is who you are? A gambler who bet her family's safety on a lie." I turned my gaze to my son. "And you? A coward who enabled her, who came to his father not with a plea for help, but with an ultimatum, ready to strip me of my home and my security to pay for your monumental foolishness." The relief on their faces curdled into shame. Chloe couldn't meet my eyes. Ethan flinched as if I had struck him. I didn't ask for details. I continued, my voice relentless. "I didn't ask how you fell into a hole with a man like Petrocelli, because the how doesn't matter. What matters is the why, and the why is weakness. Greed, a desperate, pathetic need to appear to be something you are not at any cost. You chase the illusion of a wealthy life, and in doing so, you almost led your child into a real-life nightmare." I let the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't shout. Shouting is for people who have lost control. My control was absolute. My quiet, disappointed voice was a far more effective weapon. "You think this is over?" I asked, gesturing to the letter. "You think because the monster is gone, everything goes back to normal? Let me be perfectly, absolutely clear. Normal is over. The life you were living is over. What happened this week was not a solution. It was a diagnosis. And now, we begin the treatment." I laid out my terms. They were as cold and non-negotiable as the ones I had given Petrocelli. "First, from this moment on, I am in complete control of your finances. You will hand over every credit card, every bank account password, every investment portfolio. You will be given a weekly allowance in cash. Every single dollar you spend will be accounted for. You will learn to live within your means, even if those means are now dictated by me. Second, Chloe, you are an addict. Your drug isn't a substance. It's risk and the illusion of easy money. You will enroll in therapy, a specialist in gambling addiction. You will attend every session. I will be paying for it, and I will be receiving reports on your progress. Third, Ethan, your job is a dead end that feeds your ego, but not your family. You will resign on Monday. I have a friend who owns a commercial construction company. He needs a site foreman's assistant. The pay is half of what you make now. The hours are long. The work is hard. You will start at the bottom. You will come home tired and dirty every day. You will learn the value of an honest day's labor. You will learn to build something real instead of chasing corporate phantoms. They stared at me, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. This wasn't a rescue. This was a demolition. And finally, I said, my voice dropping even lower, becoming as hard as steel. The most important rule. You have forfeited the right to make unilateral decisions about your daughter. You will not move, change her school, or make any significant choice concerning her welfare without my explicit consent. You endangered her. You brought a predator to our family's door. That is a trust you have broken, and you will spend the rest of your lives earning it back. If you resist me on any of this, if you fight me, I will not hesitate to use the full extent of my resources and believe me, they are now vast, to sue for full custody of Lily. I will prove your incompetence and your recklessness in court, and I will win. Am I understood? Silence. Chloe was crying now, silent tears tracking through her makeup. Ethan just stared at his hands, a broken man. This was not a happy family reunion. It was the wreckage of one. I had saved them from the fire, but now I had to rebuild their house from the scorched earth, whether they wanted me to or not. Am I understood? I repeated, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. The awe was gone, replaced by a grim, dawning understanding. He wasn't looking at his father anymore. He was looking at his warden. He nodded slowly. Yes, Dad. Chloe, through her tears, managed a choked sob that sounded like assent. Good, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. Then the work begins now. I left them there, sitting in the ruins of their old life, and went down to the basement to my granddaughter. The real work was about to begin. 6 months passed, not in a blur, but as a series of deliberate, carefully measured days. Autumn bled into a harsh New England winter, burying my quiet street in snow and silence. But the silence inside my family was of a different kind. It wasn't peaceful. It was the tense, watchful quiet of a truce. The changes I had enforced were not a magic wand. They were a form of slow, painful chemotherapy. The poison of their old lives had to be purged, cell by cell, and the process was brutal. Ethan started his new job. The first week, he came home with blisters on his hands and a look of shell-shocked disbelief. He was used to navigating office politics, not scaffolding. He was used to wielding spreadsheets, not shovels. There were days I saw him in his car after his shift, just sitting in my driveway for 10 minutes, his head resting on the steering wheel, gathering the strength to come inside. But he never quit. Something had broken in him that day in my living room, but something else had started to grow in its place. A quiet, grim resilience I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy who insisted on learning to ride his bike without training wheels, no matter how many times he fell. Chloe's journey was harder. Her therapy sessions were battlegrounds. Her therapist, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I had vetted myself, described her as brittle and resistant. Chloe fought against the label of addict. She saw her disastrous trades not as a sickness, but as a brilliant strategy that had simply failed. She resented me, resented the therapy, resented the modest apartment in a less fashionable town that I had moved them into. She saw her new life not as a recovery, but as a prison. Their marriage hung by a thread. The secrets and resentments that had festered beneath the surface were now laid bare. They fought, not the loud, dramatic fights of their past, but bitter, whispered arguments in their kitchen after Lily was asleep. They were two people trapped in a lifeboat I had built for them, and most days they seemed more intent on throwing each other overboard than on rowing in the same direction. I was the anchor and the warden. Every Sunday, I would sit at my kitchen table with their bank statements and receipts. We would go over their budget, line by line. It was a humiliating ritual for them, and a deeply unpleasant one for me. I saw every coffee they bought, every small, desperate attempt to recapture a piece of their old life. I wasn't cruel, but I was firm. I was teaching them a lesson I should have taught my son 30 years ago. The world does not owe you a lifestyle. You earn it. Slowly. Painfully. My relationship with them was functional. They didn't love me. They feared me. They respected the power I had demonstrated, but they resented the control I now exerted. When they looked at me, they no longer saw the simple, harmless old carpenter. They saw the architect of their new, constrained reality. There was no warmth, no easy familiarity. We were like 3 diplomats from warring countries, bound by a treaty none of us liked but all of us needed. The only peace, the only genuine light, was Lily. For her, the changes were subtle and mostly good. She had her parents home for dinner every night. Her father, though perpetually exhausted, was more present than he had been when he was consumed by his corporate anxieties. Her mother, though often sad and distant, was no longer frantically attached to her phone, chasing the ghost to the next big win. My home became Lily's true sanctuary. 3 days a week, after school, she would come to my workshop. Our project, the little wooden bird, had been finished and painted long ago. Now, we were building a dollhouse. Not from a kit, but from scratch. I was teaching her how to measure, to cut, to join. I was teaching her the properties of different woods, the strength of oak, the flexibility of ash, the fragrance of cedar. She was a natural. She had my hands, my wife's patience. She would sit for an hour, carefully sanding a tiny piece of trim, her brow furrowed in concentration. In those moments, the tense quiet of our family would fade, replaced by the gentle rasp of sandpaper on wood and the murmur of my voice explaining why you always cut away from yourself. This was the new equilibrium, a fragile, imperfect peace built not on love or forgiveness, but on necessity and control. It was not a happy ending. Happy endings are for stories. This was life. Messy, complicated, a constant, grinding effort to keep the foundations from crumbling. I knew I hadn't fixed my son or his wife. I had simply put them in a splint and hoped the bones would knit. I had bought their safety. I had paid for their stability. And the cost had been any semblance of a normal, loving family. It was a price I was willing to pay. For Lily, one Saturday afternoon in early spring, the snow had finally melted, leaving the world smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. Lily and I were in the workshop, putting the final touches on the dollhouse. It was a perfect miniature of my own home, complete with tiny, functioning window sashes and a grandfather clock the size of my thumb. Lily was carefully applying a coat of clear varnish to the tiny front door. She was holding the brush with a surgeon's precision, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. "Grandpa," she said, not looking up from her work, "why did Mommy and Daddy have to move to the new house?" The question was simple, innocent, the kind of question a child asks. But it landed in the quiet of the workshop with the weight of a slab of granite. I stopped what I was doing, polishing a tiny brass doorknob, and looked at her. I had been dreading this conversation. I had hoped to put it off for years. But children are smarter than we give them credit for. They feel the unspoken tensions. They know when a story doesn't add up. I chose my words as carefully as I would choose a piece of wood for a critical joint. "Sometimes, sweet pea," I began, my voice quiet. "Grown-ups make mistakes. They build things on ground that isn't very strong. And if you're not careful, the whole house can start to shake." She looked up at me, her bright eyes wide and serious. "Like an earthquake?" "Something like that," I said. "And when that happens, you have to move. You have to find a new place with a stronger foundation and start building again. Even if it's smaller, even if it's harder, you have to build it right this time." I picked up a piece of scrap wood from a bench. It was a beautiful piece of tiger maple with shimmering, wavy grain. "You see this wood?" I said, handing it to her. "It's beautiful, isn't it? But if you look closely, I traced a thin, dark line with my finger. You can see a crack. A weakness. If I tried to build something important with this piece, it would break under pressure." I then picked up a plain, straight-grained piece of oak. "This one isn't as flashy. It's simple, but it's strong. It doesn't have any hidden weaknesses. You can build a house on it. You can trust it." She looked from the flashy, flawed maple to the simple, strong oak, her brow furrowed. She was starting to understand. Not the details of debt or addiction, but the underlying principle. The lesson. "Your mom and dad, they were trying to build with the beautiful, weak wood," I said, "and it started to crack. So now, we're all learning how to build with the strong wood. It's not as exciting, but it's safe. It will last." This was my real mission now. Not just to control their lives, but to teach her what I had failed to teach my own son. To see the difference between appearance and substance. To understand that true strength isn't about how much you have, but about the integrity of what you've built. I would never tell her about Philadelphia. She would never know about Julian Petrocelli or the man I used to be. The ghost of William Kane was buried again, deeper than ever. But I would give her his wisdom. I would arm her with his ability to see the world not for what it pretended to be, but for what it was. I would teach her that the most important tools aren't a hammer and a saw, but clear eyes and an honest heart. She placed the piece of oak back on the bench and looked at the dollhouse, our shared creation. Solid, meticulously crafted, honest. "This house is strong, "Grandpa," she said with a certainty that made my heart ache. I put my hand on her shoulder, a gnarled, calloused old hand resting on the small, perfect bones of her future. I looked at her, my granddaughter, the only person who saw me not as a ghost or a warden, but simply as a man who built things. "Yes, it is," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I rarely allowed myself to feel. "And so are you." They had asked me for money, for a quick fix. What I gave them instead was a reckoning, a hard, painful, and necessary truth. I had paid for their silence, for the quiet, constrained life they now led. And every day, in this dusty workshop, I was working to make sure it was worth the price.